Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're watching and listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, my guest is Rebecca Rose. Rebecca Rose is a multidimensional galactic experiencer currently serving the collective with her work as a quantum energy intuitive heart seer and galactic channel. As a lifelong contactee, she was originally targeted for desirable psychic attributes. She was abducted into a multitude of dark programs from her earliest years, a path that was facilitated by family members working within the top secret domain of the deep state. She was taken by the Draco and Germans to the moon, where she worked in a genetics lab connected to Dulce and the Greys. Later, she was sent to Montauk, handled by military agencies with an interest in the exploitation of human consciousness and the warping of time to control future probabilities. Further, my lab experiences landed her on Mars, where she was engineered as a cyborg and weaponized asset. Trained as a pilot, soldier, and cloned repeatedly, she was eventually sold to the Draco Empire. In the outer reaches of the solar system beyond the Kuiper Belt, she was tasked with patrolling a galactic slave trade hub commandeered by the Draco and protecting a significant planetary portal on planet X. So there's a lot there to unpack. Rebecca, really excited to have you on. How are you doing?
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here. And when I hear that, it's like, even though I've been working with my memories and all of these not very anomalous experiences for so many years, it still sounds so, yeah, kind of extraordinary.
Yes. What happens sometimes when we reflect and look back or remember things, like for example, on the second day of the Full Disclosure Now conference, I was sitting there in a panel and just hearing the chatter of the other people when they had their turn with their microphone, it just brought up all these memories that I'd either written off or just, shuttered to the side or, didn't think much of. So uh, tell us about your voyage of discovery. Take us back to the beginning and how this came to be, because what I also like, and
Yeah.
maybe we'll get a chance to get into it later, is you know about the primary significance of the Orion Wars. And that's what I've been talking about for a long time, because a lot of us were players in the
Mm.
Orion Wars on one side or the other, or both, because we would sometimes infiltrate incarnationally into some of these more,
Yeah.
rewarding civilizations like the Draco, etc. So please, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Oh, okay. Where do we begin? I mean, for people who don't know my story, I guess the bio sits as a fairly good introduction. But I think you asked first there about like how did this all come back, or what was, how did this all begin to present itself, or so. I mean, there were some things in my memory that had been there a long time, things that had happened in my family and kind of, with the dark arts and cult abuse that had been there, and things with my father who worked in the deep state. And it was around the time of his death, the couple of years preceding his death, he just passed away in 2020, that I started to get a lot of space memories back, and all of these anomalous things started going on. In 2012, I began to meditate because my life had started to really fall apart. And I felt myself as if painted into a corner in a way. Psychologically, I was not doing well. I had very bad PTSD and panic attacks, and all these things were kind of starting to come up. And the same year I had a car accident. So I'm getting to the point of how this all came back. When I started to meditate on a really regular daily basis, I started to really tap into what was in my subconscious. And that's where memory really started to reveal. At the same time, I was kind of the bit of a nursemaid to my father as he was starting to fade with cancer. And in proximity to him, in addition to meditation, these two things were just like this explosion of space memories. And at the time I didn't really know what all that was back in, 16, 17, 18. I wasn't really familiar with all of this. So it was quite a, like running alongside a moving vehicle, trying to keep up with what the fuck am I remembering? Like, am I insane? This doesn't even make any sense. And sometimes it doesn't all lay out in a really linear way. So that can, I think, make it confusing too for us, we who are gathering memories. And there were so many different pieces from different places. So I know with the people you interview, that's probably pretty common. Yeah.
What was the catalyzing event that really kickstarted that process of memory recovery? I remember Bryce Taylor telling the story of she got into a fender bender and her head smashed into the
Oh,
windscreen, and then suddenly, all this stuff
that's
started.
exactly. I didn't realize that about Bryce. So I was going to say that in 2012, I was hit by a car on my bike. I was out on a training ride. I was a high-end athlete at the time, and this was in northern New Mexico, not far from Dulce, where I had been previously. I was hit by a car, had a concussion, had an MRI, all those things, brain injury. And I feel like that's when I received like this zip disk or something of information that had everything on it. However, at the time, it didn't really, I was given it, it unraveled in some unconscious way. And yet on some level, I knew all of it. And that's when things started to like trickle in. Mhm.
What I've noticed, one pattern that seems to have merged is there's always been this secret society, fraternal brotherhood, and also, the dark feminine aspect of this enmeshed within certain bloodline families in old Europe. And
Mm,
I believe that at least some of these, and we're just talking about Europe, not talking about the rest of the world, but especially these old line European royalty type or offshoot families, that they have been having these interactions with off-world beings as well as subterranean beings and interdimensional beings all along, right? And then later on come the crash retrievals, the advancement in technology, and then that sub
mm,
rosa secret brotherhood or fraternal order was there to begin with, and it just basically, because so many of their members were high-ranking military, aerospace, industrialists, financiers, they just
yeah.
basically intertwined and took over the whole UFO research program eventually. How did your Germanic background, your family's background, factor into this?
Yeah, well, those are some of the memories that I had, as I mentioned briefly there, from early life, from like the time I was born. I had a dark occult ritual abuse kind of stamped into my early background, and just kind of feels so crazy. My mother's family, her father was a black magician, a reverend. He was kind of working both sides of the coin, so to say, the light and the dark. Um, Yeah, so it kind of came through him, and this goes back. It goes back to old Europe. I mean, I know it's back at least 6 generations. Like, there's all this, a lot of tales. I mean, we could do just a show on that. Like a lot of, my mother's father's father was a cemetery caretaker, so like like all of these kind of anomalies in the family. My mother's brother, collects all this Nazi memorabilia and has a private cemetery on his yard. This is in New England, where I grew up. So anyway, to your point about the old, European bloodlines, and there was dark reptilian energy in that bloodline from the occult summonings that happened there in those rituals and so on. I was able to transform that DNA into a dragon line. I didn't even know what I was doing at the time, but that's what happened through the process of meditation, energy work, and just spontaneous psychic healing that happened for me. Anyway, just by way of answering your question, then what happened with that dark genetic infiltration by with reptilian, that's quite a story there. So I'll give that a pause. Yeah.
So many of these royal bloodlines and the offshoots are hybridized to begin with, whether reptilian, Draco, and or other ET or subterranean species mixed in to the DNA. And so within those bloodlines and within the DNA, there's latent metaphysical powers, the innate ability to open portals, to go through portals, what have you. What
Yeah.
were the kind of memories that came up? I mean, just talk from a standpoint of what's safe and what you're comfortable talking about. uh, what were the kind of activities you saw at some of these ceremonies as it relates to these other worldly beings?
Yeah, I have the clear, some of the memories that I have of my own family go back to an area of my world and my memory that is really pre-verbal, and I don't have a lot of some of that is very dark and not worthy of speech, I think. But I can tell you, I was experienced the colonel, as I call him, with the eyebrows. Sometimes my mind goes blank on his name.
Filipino.
Yes, Aquino, thank you. And Montauk. So I think there was already this blueprint for once we've experienced something, whether it's cult abuse, sexual abuse, or whatever, it creates a resonant frequency in our field, and we begin to magnetize more of it. So in that case, I mean, we'll go right into that, and they were definitely, military. Used satanic ritual abuse as a technology, mind control technology, and such was the case there. But there was always a sacrifice involved, and it seemed at the time of the sacrifice of the child, they would be, summoning and inhabiting, allowing the dark being to come into them. And that was also what I observed in my family and my mother's father. My mother, let's say when she'd be abusing me, she had a what we might call now as a dissociative identity disorder, used to be called MPD. She would go into like an altered state and abuse me. And she would abuse me till I was unconscious, and she'd come out of it and not recall what was happening. But in that time, I could see that she had been overtaken by something else. So again, this is like a whole thing offshoot of this is, we talk about just these things and not even get into SSP because they're so, the working with dark energy or light energy and intention and all of these, these powers or technologies, in this vein that's running through our world of, satanic energies and intentions, groups, societies, associations, cabal, running the world with that underhanded, in plain sight way that happens. So, yeah, just to say that there were, it always seemed like there was almost like an inhabitation going on, like the coming, not just summoning a being, but actually, I feel like there was some embodiment of that, if that
Yes,
makes
yes.
sense.
The hosting process and the interface between the individuals as host for beings to take them up momentarily or for longer periods of time.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Like when my mother would be, in her abuser mode, like I didn't recognize her at all. And it was quite, I mean, it's frightening for a kid because you don't know what you're gonna get. But that would be one of my earliest memories is really remembering her as, and this is hard to say, but like my mom just having these like kind of reptilian eyes when she'd get up close in my face and was in a certain mood or state or that abuse mode. And it frightened me. I never understood it. And it's like, wow, all these years later, I have such to go through childhood like that, I feel like, all the inversions were normalized, and to come out of that and look back at it and go, oh, I have so much understanding of what was going on now. It's almost like a relief to understand the genesis, the mechanism of that darkness. Yeah.
You mentioned that you had been taken to Great Lakes Naval Base. My ears perked up when you mentioned that because I remember reading an account in one of Leonard Stringfield's status reports about crash retrievals, and he talked about a flying saucer was taken there sometime in the
Oh,
60s.
really?
Yeah, and it was
Wow.
stored at a secure part of that base. So already there
Wow.
was a basis for this kind of activity there. How old were you when you were taken there, and what do you recall of the training that went
Yeah.
on there when the conditioning?
Yeah. I was 9 when I was taken there, and I have to say, wow, I'm just gonna, just a preamble say, like, when I began speaking to the fact that I was naming the base I was taken at, and twin dad, and this whole trauma-based mind control with the twinning that happened before I was sent to Mars, I mentioned Great Lakes, Naval Station, right? And I had no idea that it had come up in the testimony of Michael Ralph. I had no idea who he was. And then I'd be on an interview and somebody, Michael Salas, said, oh, do you know so-and-so that this has been mentioned before? Or, you know, so thank you. You just corroborated something for me, even more so. I didn't know that there had been any kind of ET crash or, crash retrieval that had been, I think you said, taken to that naval station. Is that correct? Yeah. Wow. So to your question, Yes, I was taken there at age 9. This was September of 1982, right before I turned 10. And I was twinned with a little boy, redheaded, sandy-haired boy named Dean, who was also 9. And they kept us in cages there. We were in underground, we were in a dome there. Um,
Just to interject really
my
quickly, when you mean twinned, could you define that term? Does it mean paired up or seemingly bonded with somebody?
Yeah, so trauma bonded. So we were kept in cages, and through trauma and betrayal rituals, love rituals, sexual rituals, psychic ritual, we were bonded as if we were almost biological twin, one body, one mind. And I would say, we could go back to I always use this as an example, the experiments by Mengele in Auschwitz in the 1940s. What were they? They were discovering all these things about how the twins work together. Now that's biological twins. With the military, they were exploring, well, how could we we don't have to have biological twins if we go through this other process. If you look at the Illuminati have used a sequence of trauma and betrayal, and there's certain there's a whole playbook, ABCD. In the end, usually one of the twins kills the other. Excuse me, that's a bit dark, but that's the basis of why would they be doing that to get us into space? What would be the point if you have somebody you love, a love-hate relationship in which you are, again, in one in body and mind, you've been sexually, psychically mated, and the only thing you care about in the world, because everything else has been so dark, if that person is on your mission, you're going to have a damn good mission, and you're going to both come back alive, and the mission's going to be done, right? So we were psychic recon soldiers, along with being like super soldiers, so to say. Yeah.
And you mentioned you were taken to a dump there, deep underground military base. A quick point about the Great Lakes area in general. It is a portal, interdimensional, vortex-ridden place. Look at all the problems on top of everything else that Chicago, Illinois, and that part of the Great Lakes area is having with portals and big bat-winged gargoyle creatures flying around and what have you, seen out there in public, right, at times. And also the fact that there's been so many disappearances of airplanes, excuse me, and
Mm.
small vessels in the Great Lakes Triangle as well. I know there's a big underground alien base near Lake Ontario, but please, the floor is yours as far as the activity that went on there.
Yeah, so I mean, I wasn't as young as the things I spoke of earlier in my family. I was 9 at the time, but we didn't see out of this. It felt like it was dark a lot. They may have kept us, I mean, I know they kept us, dark and cold, naked and so on, and without food, but um I don't I the where I'm going is that see I really didn't see beyond that world. I can't report back on that because I was so little, had no need to know anything, and was in a very extremely frozen, traumatized state throughout. So I don't have much of a recollection. Yeah.
And where does the Germanic Draco aspect start to kick in this process?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, um, as far as you mean, is
Yeah, as
that
far
like
as like
how
the
did?
off-world Germans and the projects.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
Okay, yeah. Yes, okay. So when I was a child, before I was taken to Mars for the 20 and back, I was taken to in shorter abductions, shorter periods of work, so to say, to the moon, where these were I would go to an underground, what I call like a bus stop, or it was a substation, a base, and then I'd be taken. I don't know if it was a craft that had some kind of warp drive, but I remember being strapped into, like if you're going to be on a roller coaster that goes upside down, you've got these straps here, and you're going somewhere fast. That's in my child's language, child memory, right? I'm very young. I'm 4 years old, and the backside of the moon taken to the German base where they are working with the Draco and the Greys in big genetics labs, and so which were connected to Dulce. I didn't know that from the beginning of some of my memories. On the moon, they felt like they were, akin to something, things I'd read about Dulce and the Dulce base. In any case, there was just a big cloning, hybridization, experimentation, all these massive, massive labs. Now, some of that was in Dulce because there was a jump gate between the two where they would, ferry cargo back from Dulce and, send it off to the Galactic slave trade. So to your point about the Germans, that was my to my memory and to my knowledge now, that was the most the heaviest memories of being with the Germans forthrightly. However, when I was sent to Mars later, it was with Americans that I was interacting. But the moon was strictly Germans and variety of different Greys, and then the Draco, who I was mostly interfacing with there. They were training me in very to become more psychic, to build out those psychic abilities, and to, in a way, train me to believe that I was theirs, that they would own me. And I think that in part because this was, there was things written into my bloodline that would stamp me, like almost like volunteer me to be, let's say, earmarked for the Draco. I would be owned by them later out on the Kuiper Belt. That's a really long story, but they were just priming me, I feel, in many, many ways, to be later taken into the longer programs, to be super soldiered, built out, so to speak. I just turned super soldier into a verb. Yeah. So I'll pause there.
You mentioned the Great Lakes and that there was I think you mentioned there was a jump gate there at the naval base, and that there's an analog to that on the West Coast, off the coast of San Diego. Apparently, there
Mm,
is a jump gate there also that likewise goes to the moon and Mars and probably other places. So it seems to me, and I like your thoughts on this, was it a process from the standpoint of the controllers working, the human controllers working with these ETs and Draco, that uh, that Sub Rosa secret brotherhood element was gradually read in, brought into this alien project, right? Uh, because there had been this long-standing like relationship between these secret societies and cults with non-human beings, and then with the industrial revolution, the technological innovations. And I really believe that so many of these physicists, astrophysicists, rocket engineers, some of that they came up on their with on their own. I think also there was a lot of like muses in the background there that were not quite human, that were dropping these hints and ideas. And eventually that's
mhm.
where the twain met, because then you look at the off-world programs, you look at the deep black Milab programs. In many cases, there is an element of esoterica, the occult,
Yeah.
black magic, essentially. Uh,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
what were your thoughts about seeing that level of interface? Did you see examples of, because the Draco and others with their abilities to use their mind power to,
Yeah.
change reality, what have you, and then they were trying to imbue some of those abilities within you too. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, with me, they were just trying to, how to say, like elaborating on what was already in me psychically and draw upon probably some areas of my bloodline that link back to, yeah, the occult. I don't have memory directly of that ritual signature, particularly, trauma-based mind control, like I spoke of with Aquino in Montauk, other than out there on Montauk. Yeah, I don't have recollection of that as a signature on Mars, with corporate and military interest there. I don't remember all there is, so I don't know. But on the moon, um, I don't remember that either. But it is so, like you said, it's kind of in there everywhere. The inversions and the distortions and the um, dark duplicities and the working with darker beings. On the moon, it's interesting that we could call it a German base, but wherever the Draco are, they're kind of top dog. The Greys had a huge stake, a huge investment in what was going on in those experiments, right? But they all seemed like bit players compared to the Draco. And actually the Germans seemed a bit, there was some in the labs, kind of doing menial work. They seemed a bit desouled. Like, I don't know if they were um, roboticized or something, or I don't really know. They were not sentient in the ways that I'm familiar with, let's say. And it kind of freaked me out as kids. Yeah.
And it seems like the Navy, deep black elements of the Navy were involved because they took you to uh, that base in the Great Lakes area, the Great Lakes Naval Base. In some of the other facilities you've been to, Dulce and on Mars, did you see an overt naval or naval intelligence presence? Because most of my experiences seem to have been with the weird science element of naval intelligence.
Well, that's who my father was working for, naval intelligence. Yes. I remember the woman who handled me at Montauk. I don't remember particularly, that's a great question. What's the link with naval the Navy, particularly since I came out of the Great Lakes base to go to Mars? I don't actually recall um, like Navy uniforms or who, it was more like felt more like what we call army, but there was a consortium of interests on Mars for sure. But back to Montauk, the woman who had put me in the little silver bullet coffin to do the time travel, it wasn't a chair, it was a little like oscillating energy field contraption, almost like a very sleek MRI machine that they would stick me in. It was a Navy lady who, back in the 70s, she had her like, little nylons and clicky little shoes and a navy blue little hat and, really prim. And she was full decked out with, I am, Navy. Very much how that seemed. I think there were also Air Force personnel there. And she was my handler throughout. I looked to her almost like, even though she was abuser and handler, she almost was like a surrogate mother or something. It was quite sick. But I very much remember the presence of the Navy, particularly in armed services branches, feeling more evident or up to like very clearly right there in Montauk. They weren't hidden. Yeah. Um,
What were some of the experiences you had in Dulce that you can recall? Did you see uh, did you see a lot of aliens there, for example, or do you remember what floor or what level you were at? I mean,
Yeah, it was all
granted,
Grays. I mean, well, let me rephrase that. It was Grays who were running the operation. I never saw, I was in a dungeon. It was like, I've called Montauk a Holocaust, and Dulce was really a hell realm. I mean, from what I recall. And again, I was small. These were tangents to or assignments with the moon or tasks I was given. One of them was this primary one that I remember was operating that the jump gate between the moon, the Nuckermuffin base and the labs up on the top side, backside the moon, to Dulce. So they needed a child's frequency apparently to operate the gate because some of the energetic signature of the cargo, as I've called it, which could be body parts, clones, hybrids, endocrine systems, secretions, all kinds of stuff coming out of that lab. Um, they needed to have it at a certain frequency for the jump gate to actually work. And without that, some of it could be lost in interdimensional space. But with a jump gate, you got to have, like, it seemed to me, or from my experiences and psychic information given to me, it seems like that has to be at a certain function at a steady state with a certain frequency bandwidth. And if it doesn't, things go bad. And they've invested a lot of energy and time and resources into creating these hybrids and experiments, and it's all worth a lot. They don't want to lose stuff out there. So that was one of one of the jobs I was given. And I just remember kind of looking down at it's all dark in my memory. There's this sort of orangish glow in the background and a lot of screaming, a lot of smell. And I just remember looking at the ground, like, and I was drugged in some way, and I was manipulated to be doing what I was doing and to withstand being in that sort of really kind of depraved environment with a lot going on. Yeah.
And the information that came out from Thomas Costello, and there's one guy out there that's hijacked a lot of Thomas Costello's information and inverted it, and added this whole biblical spin to it.
Oh.
The guy that calls himself Branton, but that's he even created this fake interview between Thomas Costello and himself, which never happened. I knew people back in the day that actually had been in comms with Thomas Costello after the latter had fled from Dulce. He was the RAND security specialist there, and he
Oh,
absconded.
really?
Yeah, he
Uh-huh.
absconded with a bunch of videotape and still imagery, still photographs of aliens and other aspects of the lab. Some of that is leaked out onto the internet. You can see it. But he said,
No.
Thomas Costello, and they probably ran him down, eventually killed him. They took his wife and his son, and
Mm.
when they realized what he'd done, and because there was like a brewing rebellion inside the base. There was a lot of security specialists, a lot of military personnel that didn't like what was going on, right?
Mm,
He
mhm.
talked about how hellish it was. There's even a place that you're probably familiar with the term Nightmare Hall, where a lot of the um, a lot of the genetic chimeras were being created. We have similar uh, kind of labs in China Lake, beneath China Lake, and Kirtland Air Force Base, places like that, where they do this genetic experimentation, creating creatures that never should have been created in
Yes.
the first place.
Yes, and that's why when I have described this previously in interviews, I have said, and back in the early days, I really, especially, I didn't understand how to describe these beings as if they were taken from, I've described some beings that seem like they were taken out of inner Earth and then morphed with other species that I can't even identify. Like I don't know where they got them or what they were. So thank you for mentioning that. Yeah.
Some research friends of mine in California, they had gotten to know a guy in the high desert. Uh, they were fellow joggers basically, and they just jog along. And they see the same guy every once in a while, right? And then so
Mm.
they just started talking to him, and over time, right, the guy had began to unburden himself. He says, "Well, this is going to sound unbelievable, but uh, I'm here on the surface now because every once in a while they let me come up be part of the service world again for a month or so at a time. But my regular full time job is in a deep underground base. And the guy was a neurologist. And his job in the underground genetics labs was studying the neurology of all these genetic chimeras they keep creating, right? Just this, the
Wow.
neurological brain function, what have you. And he was so like burdened with that thought and all the stuff that's going on, it nearly it drove him to distraction. You can understand. So anyway, coincidentally, by a epiphany, he runs into these friends of mine who happen to be fellow joggers, and the story came out. The point being is that places like Dulce, China Lake, other places, they've been creating all these genetic chimeras for so long, just as was the case in Atlantis, and just as the case with the Draco, the Greys, and other beings. Getting back to
Mm.
Thomas Costello, he mentioned that in his time in the early 70s, there was at least 18,000 grays. He said specifically there's about 18,000 grays at that facility. And then you mentioned a moment ago, like that you just saw a bunch of grays there. That would make perfect sense.
Yeah, that's all I saw there. I had not heard of that large of a number, but yeah, when you ask like, what do you remember of XYZ base or the, Great Lakes station, like we have such no need to know. And so and it's like memories that come back through such trauma that created them, it's so difficult sometimes to remember all of the details we want. Yeah. Yeah, so I appreciate all your knowledge on that too. And it's interesting that this was like I was there in the late 70s. I was born in 72. So this was I was around 5. Yeah, I mean it was at that time, the whole shootout with Phil Schneider and the
Yes.
Great and Dulce, that was also in the late 70s. So there's a lot of activity when I look at it psychically now. I don't see much going on there at all. Um, I don't know what the reports are coming out of Dulce these days, but it seems like it was built upon a portal that site was used by native people and then co-opted by, other forces because it's such an energy vortex there. And I actually lived in that area of the world for 20 years without really having full memory back. I lived maybe, I mean, it was 100 miles from Chelsea for decades. Like, the chances of that. So, yeah.
Well, you mentioned earlier that they had to have a certain energetic frequency bandwidth that they'd somehow elicit or engender through certain children of the right energetic frequency. And it's interesting because Thomas Costello pointed out in one of the levels at Dulce, that's what they specialized in, working with the ectoplasmic fields of living beings, the energy bodies of humans, what we would call the soul. There was a whole department set up in Dulce specifically to investigate and exploit that capability, right? And I
Mhm.
spoke with Sarah Stanga. She surfaced for a little while, endured a lot of abuse, typically from other people, supposedly in the field, on top of all the harassment and abuse she was getting and the targeting and the gang stalking.
Mhm.
But in the amount of time
Mhm.
she came out, you can see an interview, if you can still find it, that she did with Miles Johnston for the
Oh,
Basis
okay.
Project.
Wow. Yeah.
And Sarah told me that, and she also was manipulated by Michael Aquino. And she said in one of the facilities, underground bases she was at, she observed firsthand how they would, through one means or another, activate particular chakra points in individuals, probably people that were pulled into these projects. And
Yeah.
each chakra point would open a specific type of portal into a specific type of realm, right? So they would activate like the sexual chakra in individual, and it would open a certain portal into a certain realm. So it's interesting that you had mentioned that thing about children's frequencies being exploited in such a way as to facilitate the jump gate process.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting too, this kind of in collusion with what I see in client sessions sometimes is that those two lower energy centers, the root chakra and the second chakra, uh, sometimes are like portals that are not closed and they're letting in, like the client might be having a lot of interference and then like illness or this and that and the other. And it's like, well, you got a kind of a gate that's still open there, and sometimes it's trauma they've been through or their ancestors or something that was um, sort of exogenously introduced, let's say, and I see that sometimes in meditation, psychically, my own chakras, energy centers will open up like portals or crystal balls into other worlds and give me information. So there's a lot going on there. Yeah, I appreciate you bring up that piece of, what we might call esoterica or the real workings of the human system once we become our own masters of the universe within. And that's to the point too of your, saying like they take what's there and they invert it. So they're capitalizing on our most majestic inheritances, right? Our own energy system. Yeah.
We have these innate abilities. In truth, a great many people, not necessarily part of or an offshoot of these royal so-called bloodlines. You mentioned the dragon bloodlines earlier. I'm descended from that as well. But there's just a lot of people in general are hybrids of one sort or another, and they have
Yeah.
these latent metaphysical capabilities. And what they tend to do is they exploit these innate abilities within us to advance their agenda, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Mhm.
the really irksome part of it to me, because we should, at a conscious level, be able to call upon and manifest these powers. Sometimes they we manifest them in state of dire emergency or whatever. We can do things when we really need to. It's like an
Yeah.
innate ability we have, but the ability of certain alien groups and these deep black military projects to engender these abilities within us. And see, you talked about the states of consciousness at that level of deep black. It's not so much levels of classification and security clearances; it's levels of consciousness that one is allowed
Yeah.
to
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for saying that. It's like a lot of times when I speak to others, or the interviews can go into the very the 3D aspects of the craft and the this and the that and the more material matter, but I love how this is kind of going into the energetic dynamic behind things and how that's manipulated and how things run upon all of that which is invisible, to our usual vision, and sensibilities.
We know here on Earth the human trafficking problem is off the charts, basically. Never
Yeah.
before in history, in part due to there's so many more people here to abduct and enslave. And I've spoken to individuals. One of them come to mind is a guy who grew up in one of these bloodline families. He said the family he was a part of was much higher in the pecking order than the Rothschilds. From his perspective, the Rothschilds were kind
Mm.
of middle of the road types, executors of the wills of others here on the surface. But at
Mm.
his level, he was able to see not only Draco meetings between his family, he called it the family, and the Draco, but he said there were at times these other off-world beings, and the Draco meetings often had to do with the off-world trafficking, right?
Yes,
And he,
huff, 1,000%.
yeah,
Yes.
and he was present at some of these meetings, like
Wow.
unwillingly happened to be
Hmm.
had to be there. But he said there were times when other ETs would show up they never seen or heard descriptions of,
Yes.
and they would be part of this off-world human trafficking operation. Also, they'd liaise with elements here, human or non-human, otherwise, and then they make all these arrangements to offload to ship out, uh, you know, uh, basically slaves. And we see
Yep.
we see a cinematic version of this in the Stargate movie and the Stargate TV series saga. Because if you remember the movie, which is if you can find a director's cut, especially that was a classic. But
Oh, really? Yeah. I haven't seen it actually. So,
oh
yeah.
wow, well the whole thing was about Stargates and Orion and aliens pretending to be Egyptian gods like Ra. But anyway, point being is that uh, they had taken a bunch of human slaves out of ancient Egypt through a Stargate and brought them to a distant part of the universe to be slave labor to mine the minerals that make up the Stargate. So again, we have that story of
Wow.
the juxtaposition of Orion, off-world mining, gods pretending, aliens pretending to be gods, right? And then we have this human element, military element, trying to sort its way through all that. Of course, in the epics, the Star Wars movie, Stargate movie, and the TV series, the military usually are the good guys in all this, right? Of
Right,
course,
right, right.
more
Yeah,
appealing,
yeah.
but
So, wow. So the galactic slave trade was really booming when I was in the SSP and when I was owned by the Draco and the Kuiper Belt. Yeah. I mean, they commandeered and were very much in control of a big galactic slave trade hub out there. And a planetary portal that was also very significant for the trade. So it's a lot of, I was out there protecting their assets, so to speak. But it was like what was involved with that slave trade would be shocking to most people. Like and it wasn't just humans, it was parts and bits and hybrids and clones and the hybridization aspect of beings who were brought from other worlds and just things that are beyond, like, I don't have the English language vocabulary to describe, like it escapes my language. Yeah. And I don't know that that's operating at the same extent in the trafficking in the off-world arena as much as it is on Earth now. I mean, that's a curiosity, more than a curiosity of mine. Have we moved beyond some of that, because it is in such violation of what we could call the galactic codes or so, which, that's another topic of conversation. But I came from a ship, a Light Alliance. I'll just call it that, a ship that is, I experienced myself in tandem on that ship. Now, and at the time that I came in and incarnated for an exploration of these projects to learn more about the galactic slave trade, you know, I mean, that was part of my mission at a deeper, broader level, right? To kind of come in and infiltrate, be a double agent, get us information from deep within the belly of the beast, as they call it, particularly about the slave trade, because we had every interest in seeing what was going on and what we could do about it. Yeah.
key point to make. One of my colleagues, you might have heard her interview on my show, goes by the pseudonym Delta, and they put her consciousness into a small girl. And whether it was on this planet and some other world or some alternate reality, she was in a big mansion, and she, along with other young children, were bids were put out for them, basically, kind of like you see,
Yeah.
the old school way of people sitting in a room and raise their hand when they want to raise the bid, whatever. But this was all
Hmm.
done with computers, where there
Hmm.
were the images of the children in cages would show up on the computer screen, and bids would come on from different users, right? And so
Yeah.
she was tasked at some level to put her consciousness either on her own standalone oversoul job, or someone or something put it in there, into the consciousness, into the body rather, of a child, a young girl. And she reckons it was a way to find out more about that particular operation. And
Yeah.
I
Oh,
like,
yeah.
and
Mm.
I like to see silver linings in this, and I'm not just grasping at straws or
Yeah.
whistling past
Yeah.
the graveyard. But I must say, kudos to all of us that have been, and what I went through was infinitely more, not as bad, let's say, as what you and others have gone through, right? I
Mm.
mean, I went through some lousy experiences myself, but when I hear some of
You
these
did.
stories, it's
Yeah.
just, the triumph of the human spirit. And the point of relevance is, congratulations, because all yourself and all these others, they've managed to infiltrate the most highly classified deep black program or programs in our plane of existence, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
talk about a
Yeah.
tall order, you talk about a soul mission to come in and do a specific job. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, it takes a special hardy type of soul to be willing to put up with all that abuse for a specific, and sometimes as yet undefined purpose. Because a lot, again, the even for our own purposes, uh, for security purpose, a lot of stuff we're not allowed to remember, because it would just
Yeah.
be a source of detriment or a source of danger to us.
Mm, Thank you for putting it in that light. It was a game changer for me when I began to recall the memories, the lighter memories from the ship, that I'm also on, and to understand the deeper underpinnings, the why, not just like random stuff that happened to me that kind of destroyed my life, but like why did I come into the incarnation? What was going on at the soul level? What was the imperative of my soul to come in and explore this? And in fact, I don't know that I would have recollection of my hybrid son on the ship and people that I love, up there. I don't know if I would have remembered if I wasn't also having to slog through all these veins of darkness to get to the bottom of the fucking story, right? Especially in the aftermath of my father's death. Like, I didn't even know my father worked in the classified world. I didn't know he was involved with all this
Yeah, well,
until
tell me what you know about him. You said he was an asset, or worked at some level for naval intelligence. So have you been able
Yeah,
to
he worked
glean?
for yeah, so I mean he was a mad scientist kind of engineer. They would give him a budget and he had to solve problems for a company at the time that became Lockheed Martin back in the 70s. It was called Sanders Associates. They were bought out by Lockheed Martin. This was in Nashua, New Hampshire. Still the biggest, the defense industry's biggest employer in town. And now it's BAE Systems. In any case, he worked there and was also working with naval intelligence. And I found out before his death with NASA and the CIA. He traveled a lot when I was a kid. I said, Dad, where were you going during those times of travel where you were, I didn't know where he was. I was a kid. I didn't ask too many questions, wasn't told anything. But he said, oh, yeah, I had to report back to CIA headquarters. And I remember I was actually in hospice with him at the time as this was all rolling off his tongue. And I just like had to pick my jaw up off the floor. I was like kind of dazed and shocked. Like I never knew that. But that's the essence of these guys in Deep Black. Like that's why that they vet them because they have a proclivity toward don't ask, don't tell, and also just they are handled in such a way where that that inclination is just deepened and deepened and deepened. So they're carrying so many secrets that I don't even know. I think, my father drank himself to death. So he had some things he was running away from. What was it exactly? And how much did he know about what happened to me and my brother, who was also in the programs? What responsibility did he feel he might have had? I mentioned this in other interviews where I was given psychically in meditation. This was years ago, and several days in a row, I saw um, my father sitting in this kind of conference room. With two grays, guys in navy suits and guys in just like in a business attire, and they were pushing papers at him and said, "Do this, it's for the betterment of the world." And I believe this was some part of my psyche showing me through the quantum space, like, oh, your father sold you both out to this. How conscious was he at the time? I don't know, because he certainly had his own handlers, and once they have you in that arena, when you're working at these very high levels of the classified world in deep black projects, they not only own you, but they own your family too. So that's I've very much learned that. My mother was brought in the German bloodline. I feel like they were breeders for program kids, and that really bears out in all the things that I see. Both my parents were in the military. They met in the Army, Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, 1965. Had very little in common and got very married very quickly. So there was just something in my father had a I want to say like a Zeta. He was like a Zeta starseed. He was abducted as a kid. He was taken into gray ships. He was seemed to have almost like a family relationship with the Greys. So, and I said before he died, Dad, look at me. When you were solving your work problems, were you getting help from up there? And he looked at me like he had his like a child with a candy, his hand in the candy jar, and he just grinned slyly and he looked away. He said, "Yes."
Well, yes, that's what I felt because if you look at, and I, brought up this example many times. When did the Wright brothers get off the ground? 1903, thereabouts. And here it is.
Mm.
Well, 2003 plus 22 years, so a scant 123, 24, 25 years thereabouts, right?
Yeah.
And we go from these cloth fabric covered biplanes, which traveled only a short distance in the first flight in Kitty Hawk, to advanced like plasma driven craft and satellite and nanotech. And that's way too short of a time. In linear time terms, from 1903 to the present, to have what we have today. And Herman
Yeah.
Oberth and Werner von Braun talked about this too, that there had to have been help, and they would have known. They had to have been help from some higher intelligence, right? I mean, granted, some of these physicists in these weapons establishments and R&D centers are probably hybridized themselves and have been insinuated through one hook or crook into those positions anyway. But
Yeah.
I do believe this concept of these muse drops, for lack of a better term, like what your father alluded to, that they just get this insight to do certain things, right? I mean, like for example, who in a normal, I'm not saying that your father was directly involved in this, but who would get the bright idea of, well, let's just traumatize the hell out of these little kids and see how, what way we can exploit them. That's such an inhuman, non-human
Right.
mentality.
Exactly. Yeah.
And but what they've
Yeah.
done with the hybridization is they've transferred not just the neurology, but the consciousness and the essence of these Draco and other beings, lock, stock, and barrel into these people, and these people are used as a medium to advance that Draco agenda, which is what we're seeing, right? This
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
like a
Hmm.
reptilian overlordship sphere of influence we live in, right? So I'm not
Yeah.
worried about big Atlas craft coming. Well, this planet is already under control, right?
Mm, with like I described it kind of in detail, the naval handler I had out in Montauk, I've reflected at length and continue to about the people who were working there like her. What did she go through and what was she, to your point, inhabited by to be doing this job? really so cut off from her own humanity. This is just one
Yes.
example.
And just to
Uh,
interject really quickly, because some people still have their dignity and their integrity and their human compassion intact. And I think of
yeah.
uh, Helga Moro's father. He was a German
Mhm.
expatriate, and his daughter Helga was used in a genetics experiment when she was 8 months in the womb,
Mhm.
specifically to make her more intelligent and more psychic, right? And her father,
Mhm.
Dr. Frederick Augustus Kephars, he was in at the very early stages of the what later became the giant aero space conglomerates like Lockheed Martin. He worked for Glenn L. Martin, actually, which became Martin. Martin Marietta eventually merged into Lockheed. But Helga remembers one day, and actually it was a number of days, when her father was so disconsolate, so depressed. And she asked him what's going on, and he just kept muttering, everything is a lie. History is a lie. The world is a lie. Everything we do is a lie. And it
Mhm.
turned out that one of his jobs was helping human looking aliens assimilate into human society, right? And I knew a gal who was tasked with training hybrids that look human in order to fit into society. She was basically enslaved to do that, right? So here is Helga's father just lamenting the fact that everything is a lie and that he had to help these human looking aliens fit into human society. And the circumstances of his death were unusual too, because
So,
suddenly he dies, and then the state, basically, the corporation takes over all of his funeral arrangements. The pallbearers were these big burly guys no one had ever seen before. They were not part of the family, right? And
mm,
then so they faked his death. They threw him into a loony bin first, right, for his own mental
mm.
health and for his own safety. When it became apparent that he was starting to be a security leak, right? Because he had taken Helga into an underground base beneath Golden, Colorado, when she was in her early 20s, right? And she'd
Uh,
seen like pictures of what we now know was a space shuttle and what have you on the walls, but that was like in the 1960s, right? So she
mm,
knew that he was involved in these weird science projects. She just couldn't figure out the exact scale and the depth that he was involved in. But getting back to your point about the uh, the unreality of it all, and the fact that there's these different worlds at play, and everything is walled
mm.
off by consciousness. So what happened was, to round out Helga's story, they threw her father into a loony bin, they faked his death, and then years later, when Helga was going through like a lot of these emotional challenges for all of her experiences, if you ever saw the video of Duncan Cameron and Helga Moro, they went into the accessible parts of Montauk. And then Duncan Cameron, I think that was his name. He was a psychic that sat in the Montauk chair and summoned that monster and opened the portal. Anyway, he
Oh,
breaks down.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he breaks down and starts sobbing and crying because of what had happened. All the memories were coming back when he was at that base as a boy, right? And Helga was there
Mm,
at that time. Well, anyway, one night this light appears in Helga's bedroom, and it's her father inside, encased within this light. And he told
mm,
her, I'm not really dead. I've escaped to another realm, right? Because he was a scientist in a weird science project, probably had the means to do so, his exit strategy, if you will. He said, I'm still watching over you. Only call upon me when you really need help, and I'll do what I can from where I'm at, right? And then
yeah.
he disappeared, right? So basically, what he did was they faked his death, and as part of a deal or whatever, or maybe by hook and crook on his own, he managed to find the means to escape off of Earth and go either to some realm or some other dimension or some other planet somewhere. But he told her very clearly, I'm always here watching you. Just only call me when you really need to. So that's an example of this breakaway civilization that we've been talking about.
Mm, Yeah, there's so much to that. And gosh, we've touched on so many things in our time together. I was thinking about the harvesting of souls, by the Draco. When I was on Mars, there was I was a pilot. I was patrolling the bases, and I'd been remotely I was on a out beyond. the Draco came in and into my consciousness and kind of disabled my the way I interacted with the ship, and kind of severed my connection back to Central Command. I flew into their like it was a soul scalping operation. To make a long story short, they're on Mars, very illicit. What were they? They were harvesting souls and also the bodies to then be um, it's like you could put a different consciousness into a body, put the consciousness into another, it's like mix and match. And I was shot down there, but it was like something that, I was kind of grateful to remember, because it was like, wow, I have such insight into the soul itself is like a real, we talk about technology and DNA being the currency of exchange out in the solar system in this quadrant of the galaxy, but there's something about souls, the harvesting of souls, like that gets into, again, a discussion that we can't quite contain within linear language. It's so complex. Some of that was like the souls seem to be, I want to say, almost like, for lack of better words, food for the Royal Draco. And then all the, things that were going on in the programs. I don't know all there is to know about it, but it was so interesting too that the beings that picked me up and kind of rescued me slash, I don't know if they saved me or killed me, but the local reptilians were also interested. Does she have a soul? They wanted to, so to say, inspect my soul. And I've been doing a lot of probing around what the fuck the Greys were doing in utero with me through my mother's womb. When I was back in the desperate throes of going through all the really acute, intense space memories, I didn't ask enough questions and look deeply enough about the Greys and what the heck they were doing throughout the conception process and the gestation, birthing, pre-verbal times anyway. To the point about the soul, I was in the float tank last night, which changes my brainwave states. Bear with me, I'm getting to the point. And I heard a message psychically from Gray saying, because I've been on this trail of like, what did you guys do to me? And they said, we brought you close to death. Sick and despicable things were done, it's true, but this is how we gained both insight and access to your soul. And I feel on reflection late last night that they were interested in how a soul comes into embodiment in human form, also how it leaves through the death process. Something of that was also interesting to them. So there's a lot of kind of subtle and nuanced things going on way beyond the material plane within all of this.
I can confirm some of that because myself, Lorena Smith, Evie Lorgan, and Craig Bowers, and others, we had this group. We were used in these individually, but also in these group Milab experiences. And again, it was naval intelligence, but it was also, in this instance, it was the Greys. We were
Mm,
taken by the Greys on a ship, and Lorena remembers looking out one of the portals and windows, and seeing, landmarks that she was familiar with because she lived in the high desert of Southern California, Apple Valley, next to Victorville. And long story
mm.
short, and this is what the Greys told us, they put us as close to death as possible to induce a near-death experience.
Yeah.
And then for whatever unspecified purpose, right, they that was part of the program. They had to induce this near-death experience in order to manipulate us further. So, yeah, and the time we got
Wow.
left, because I know that you got a boogie pretty soon. Any final words, and then we'd love to get you back on the switch again. The Cosmic
Yeah,
Switchboard. That's my nickname for us.
yes, thank you so much. Like I'm just sort of like riveted with what you're talking about. Like when you came to my channel and we had our interview, it was like, oh, keep going. This is so like it's fascinating because you're such a wealth of information and you're like kind of reflecting back the validity of some of my recall. I really, really, really can't tell you how valuable that is. And especially because I've been on task with like the nuanced manipulations of the Greys. I appreciate what you just shared. And I have felt that being brought close to death had a purpose for them. Like they were learning so much, over and over again, like with the experiences I related in the Montauk, the Silver Bullet, with a Navy lady and going out to look at time where I'd be brought close to death over and over, NDE. But I feel like there's some like to use your word silver lining in this, that I can plumb the depths of this to learn more about, what are the spiritual gifts when we do close in on the that transmogrification of soul that is death. What can I learn? What can I remember? I want to go is a lot of times I don't want to go back in and remember all the terrible things. Like I just want to get away from it, to be honest. But I like kind of have this obsessive imperative to learn and remember those moments, because there's something I need to live this human life well. So I know that might not make sense in a conventional way, but I'm very, very curious. Maybe that's what keeps me, going through these memory fields. So.
Well, thank you for the work you've been doing. Definitely want to get you back on. And if you want me back on your show too, I'd love to come back
Yes,
on.
we'll keep exchanging. This is beautiful. I so appreciate being able to have the opportunity to go deep and talk about more than just the superficial layer of story, but like we said, the psychospiritual underpinnings of all these programs and the genesis and intentions behind them. So thanks for
And a
having me
lot
on.
of that was done at Dulce, because if one studies the original Dulce papers, uh,
Yeah.
they were deeply invested, the aliens and the military and the Department of Energy, with
Mhm.
study of the human soul. And surprise, surprise, why is it that Los Alamos, of all places, does the Human Genome Project, where they map the whole human genetic code, right? Of all places, a place where they make weapons of mass destruction. So, anyhow, thank you so
Point,
much,
points. Yeah,
Rebecca.
so
Uh,
well said. Yeah.
let's
Thank you so
catch up
much,
some other
James.
time. Thank you for what you do.
Yeah,
And to
we
all our
will.
dear listeners and viewers out there, wherever you may be, whatever you may be doing, have a very pleasant time. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Okay. Bye-bye.